Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 31. And just a quick update for those of you who have been sending emails about the 25k sub competition. As you probably heard in the last Drydock episode, my ISP was up the creek without a paddle for over a week, hence my slowness of reply. Believe it or not, shall we say, rodentia of the grey squirrel variety, believe it or not, actually chewed their way through the ISP cable, hence why the signal was basically non-existent. That, as you may have guessed from the fact that this is being uploaded, has been replaced, so I will be getting back to you in good time regarding those matters. Anyway, on with the first Drydock of March, which therefore means it's the Patreon Drydock, so Patreon questions away. Tuning 3434 asks a three-part question. He says, could you give an explanation on the difference between the US flank speed and the UK full speed ahead? As flank speed implies maximum disregarding the deterioration of the propulsion system, while full speed doesn't. Then is this terming an artifact of reciprocating engines, or does it mean anything in the turbine engine era? And can I give some noticeable examples when flank speed was used in operations? So this one requires a little bit of explanation. In the US Navy, as far as I can find, there are four standard settings for speed. You have standard speed, which is whatever speed the ship is rated at during its test trials and everything. So this is commonly the speed you'll find expressed in things like Jane's Guides to Fighting Ships. Below that you have 1/3 speed and 2/3 speeds, which are fairly self-explanatory. So if we take a theoretical ship capable of 30 knots, you've got 1/3 speed of 10 knots, 2/3 speeds of 20 knots, and standard speed of 30 knots. You then have full speed, and this is because although ships' engines are rated at a certain amount of horsepower and the ship is rated for a certain amount of speed, there's always a little bit of extra reserve on tap. And full speed, as far as I can determine, is effectively defined as the maximum actual sustainable speed of the ship. So if you have your 30-knot ship, if that ship on trials, on a trial run operating at its stated power could make, I don't know, 31.5 knots, then its full speed would be that, because that is the speed that it can sustain and for prolonged periods of time. Flank speed is basically a cue to bring the engines up to absolute maximum power, i.e. every last drop of power that you can get out of it. Obviously, as with a car, if you run it redlined the entire time, it's going to wreck the engine in fairly short order, and you're going to burn through fuel very quickly, but those extra few knots of speed might make all the difference. There is a slight distinction. With flank speed, you bring the engines up to that rating, whereas with emergency speed, or emergency flank, or flank emergency, however which way around you want to say it, that implies basically slam it all the way up to the top immediately, because presumably you've got to get out of dodge pretty quickly. And the difference between flank and emergency is because, as well as running the engines at maximum revolutions, obviously causing damage, with something as big and complicated as a marine power plant, there is usually also some damage implications if you try to ramp an engine up to full speed as quickly as it can physically speed up. The usage on British ships and other ships of the Commonwealth, like the Royal Australian Navy, is slightly different. So they have three settings. So they have a slow ahead and a half ahead, which are your operational settings. And although that might immediately sound like, oh, well, that means in theory they can only ever travel at half the maximum speed, they are, as I said, abstract concepts. So slow ahead is a defined number of RPM for that particular ship, which has been determined to be the ship's slow speed. So you don't need to say anything for anything further than slow ahead, but if you give that order on, say, a British ship, you will simply be moving forward or astern at the speed at which that ship has been determined to be moving slowly. Half ahead, you give an order, a supplementary order for the engine revolutions, as this is your standard speed. It's basically don't tax the engines. So if you wanted to move, let's say your turbines could move at up to 5,000 RPM, if you wanted to move for their normal rated revolutions, you might order half a head revolutions 5,000, which would be your sort of moving ahead at your maximum normal rated speed. So again, in a case of our 30 knot ship, that would take you up to 30 knots. But if you wanted to go at a slower speed, you might say half a head revolutions 2,000, and that would move you ahead under normal engine operating parameters, but at 2,000 RPM. The full speed ahead, that, as it implies, has the word speed into it, and that's similar to flank speed in that it basically says just maximum power possible, but because it's reserved for emergencies, it doesn't need the emergency moniker attached to it in order to indicate that you need it this instant. So if you're on a Royal Navy ship and you order full speed ahead, the engines will just be slammed into maximum possible power output, and you'll go motoring off into the sunset at a considerable rate of knots. And as is somewhat indicated in the answer, the terms are still meaningful in the turbine engine age. Basically, the only instance I can find where the two terms might not be meaningful is if you're powered by a nuclear reactor, as the chances are that if your reactor is operating at 100% power output, you are probably going to face physical limitations of your system somewhere else down the line, and you're not actually going to be able to channel 100% of your power to your engines without something else going catastrophically wrong. But in the era of steam turbines and now gas turbines, it still does apply, because, as I said, you have a ship's rated maximum speed, and then there's sort of the two stages above that, which is how fast it can actually go sustainably, and then there's how fast can it go for a short period of time before the engines explode. And you might need that last bit of speed, especially if you're in the case of dodging torpedoes or such like. As for a notable battle example, one example would be HMS Exeter facing Graf Spee at the Battle of the River Plate, where the order for full speed ahead was given to drive the ship as close to Graf Spee as possible, because the captain realised quite accurately that sitting at long range or closing at the normal speed would allow the German ship to just blow it out of the water with its 11-inch guns before Exeter could get meaningful replies in. So at that point, when the choice is or get exploded, there wasn't really much to be lost by shredding the engines a little bit to try and close in a bit faster, and therefore be able to bring your guns into operation a bit sooner. And of course, if you are happening to sail a knot or two faster than your rated maximum speed, that might throw off the enemy's gunnery a little bit. Although, obviously, in the case of radar gunnery, it will just supply you with the correct information anyway, but hey, worth a shot. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks a very long and complicated question that effectively boils down to what would the practicality have been of the Germans supplementing their surface commerce warfare raiding efforts by effectively sending the high seas fleet out into the Atlantic and ordering them to scatter and attack everything in sight, rather than simply sitting in port and waiting for a grand battle to happen, that obviously then happened at Jutland and then not ever again. Specifically in the context of 1918, just after the Russians have been ejected from the war. Well, it certainly has the capacity to cause a great amount of havoc. The problems that you would encounter would be, one, the German fleet is still stuck in Germany and only has two ways out into the Atlantic, and unlike in World War II, they don't control the French coast, which means that if they want to send their entire fleet out that way, they've got to move it out at least as far as the western approaches or the Denmark Strait as a single unit before scattering, which effectively means a mass fleet sortie, which means the Grand Fleet will almost certainly try to intercept on the way, which then leads to a big fleet battle. And obviously, if you try and send them out in squadrons or small penny packet type operations, because of the narrowness of those two approaches, again, the British can cut you off and destroy the squadrons piecemeal with superior forces. But assuming that I don't know, maybe the British intelligence screws up or the weather is terrible and you manage to avoid them and you get out into the Atlantic, then yes, it would cause a vast amount of havoc. Um, the single biggest issue at that point would be that the German Navy was not particularly designed for long range operations, so they would begin running out of fuel very quickly. And obviously, yes, they could capture ships and supplement from their coal bunkers, because obviously everything is coal powered apart from the partially oil fired units, but most of the German fleet would be able to refuel from captured prizes to a certain degree. And yeah, there would be, it would cause an awful lot of very interesting combats, because the choices faced by the British would be, well, they'd probably have to scatter the convoys again, because with that many capital ships around, convoys could be found and destroyed pretty easily. And yeah, there would probably be a lot of equal and unequal fights on both sides, because the situation would force, politically and publicly at least, force the Grand Fleet to go after at least the biggest concentrations of German ships. So there would be an absolute carnage caused on the Atlantic for a while. The main problem, as was found by both von Spee's squadron and other German raiders later on, is that eventually your engines need maintenance, and capturing fuel, like we described, is a bit of a diminishing returns. It'll extend your range, but not indefinitely. And as ships start to slow up through machinery faults and lack of fuel, they start to become cornered and picked off a lot more easily. And then eventually a lot of them will just run out of fuel. So it's kind of an all or nothing thing. So yes, you might inflict significant losses. Well, you will inflict significant losses on the merchant ships. You may well inflict significant losses on elements of the Allied fleets, assuming they don't form sort of and sail out by battle squadron and just try and pick you off one by one. But the main issue, which I think is probably the reason they didn't go for it, is because you are effectively throwing your fleet away. If it either wins or your entire fleet is gone. Maybe a few stragglers will get back, but then you have no real effective fleet to deter the Allied fleets thereafter. And for the time that they could operate, assuming that the Grand Fleet, and I suppose by 1918 the American fleet as well, those fleets could contain the effort somewhat, as I said, by sailing in battle squadrons to protect the most valuable ships and small convoys. And a scattered high seas fleet, well, obviously it would be very ad hoc and luck trying to concentrate any significant number of ships at that point once they've scattered. So it would cause a lot of damage, but I don't think it would tip the war in Germany's favour. Although it would be a very interesting scenario to try, but as I said, the main reason it's probably not been done is because it would write off the German fleet, and the German fleet would be perfectly aware of that. And when the Kaiser tried to write off his fleet in one glorious single engagement, they mutinied. So the chances of being told, well, you're probably going to die in battle, but also you might, well, run out of supplies, whether that's food, water, or coal at some point, and spend your last few days wandering miserably around the Atlantic, they probably would mutiny even faster. Matthew Allen Adkins asks, why does every examination of the Montana class assume she would be stuck with the older power plant as opposed to the over 200,000 horsepower power plant that was used in the Iowas and the Essexes? Is it just a matter of sticking to designs as written, or was the Montana just too heavily built otherwise? Basically because the power plant takes up the single largest amount of space in most battleships and battle cruisers and large warships of any sort for that matter. And the difference between a power plant that can generate the horsepower that was required for Montana to move through the water at 28 knots, as opposed to the 212,000 shaft horsepower power plant in some of the other ships, is quite considerable. And if you extend the engine space and boiler space by that much, you physically are enlarging the hull, and that may upset the hydrodynamics of the hull anyway. I mean, if you look at the Iowa, in a lot of respects outside of the turrets, as we've said before, the Iowa is effectively a stretched South Dakota, and look at the amount of stretching that was needed both to facilitate the actual increase in power plant and to facilitate the hydrodynamics in the hull that were needed to get it up to that kind of speed. So if you just sort of cut a Montana class in half down in the middle and open it up so that you can include a bigger power plant, you lengthen the ship. You've then got to find something to do with the rest of that lengthened section above the engine and power plant level, and you've just increased the displacement quite significantly. So without significantly changing the hydrodynamics, you may not have bought yourself all that much in terms of speed, maybe a knot or two extra in exchange for an awful lot more expense, and compromising the ship's capabilities in some other aspects. So yeah, I mean, the engine design is what it is, and I doubt they would have tried to stick in any bigger power plant for those reasons, because operating the power plant at the design stage is a major design change. It's not like, say, a World War One era ship being refitted into war, where the engines and boilers themselves have physically gotten more efficient, so you can get more horsepower out of the same or less space. Paul from Chicago asks, after the development at HMS Excellent rammed the use of red hot shot into the Royal Navy, how was red hot shot used aboard ship, and how did it compare to contemporary shell guns? What about shells with molten iron? Did the imminent threat of navalized red hot shot and molten iron shell technology, more than the declining cost of an increasing quality of iron, lead to the rise of the ironclads? So red hot shot was used. Ironically enough, red hot shot was used more on shore-based fortifications than on ships, because obviously forts tend to be made of stone and they're therefore decidedly less flammable than wooden ships or ships with wooden hulls, or ships generally, because even if you're using an ironclad ship, you've got gunpowder and wooden decks and all sorts of wonderful flammable and explosive things around, which you don't tend to find in most forts, apart from the ammunition, obviously. But they were still used on ships. The main problem with using red hot shot a lot of the time was quite how you did it. Once you got the era of steam-powered steam and sail vessels, so steam-powered wooden ships, it got a bit easier because you could use the furnaces of the engines to heat up the furnaces of the boilers. I mean, to heat up the shot. But then you've got to account for the fact that you've then got to get that shot from the engines up one, possibly more decks, in order to get that into the gun before it's gone cold enough that it's really a bit of a waste anyway. And so, like, say, with the CSS Virginia that we were talking about in the Battle of the Hampton Roads earlier in the week, or in the month, I mean, only a few guns could be served by the provision of red hot shot, which limits the number of guns on a broadside ironclad that can effectively use it. So when the centre battery ironclads show up, or use fewer larger guns, obviously then that increases the percentage of guns that you can use your red hot shot in. The further development to that, as you mentioned, was the so-called Martin's shell, and the Martin's shell was a hollow metal sphere, and then they actually had a forge furnace down in the engine room where you would create molten iron, pour the molten iron into the shell, and then you'd fire that at the enemy. This was considerably more effective than standard red hot shot, mainly because it was just so much hotter, and therefore you could also supply more guns with it, because you could it would retain a useful heat for an awful lot longer. Quite scary, and obviously there's the morale effect of assuming that it doesn't just lodge or burst somewhere in the ship and set things horribly on fire. The spray of molten iron can cover a much larger area, and that increases the chances of finding something that will burn really nicely. It also is very demoralizing for the crew when you have sheets of molten metal spraying around the interior of the ship and onto them. I wouldn't say the rise of the use of red hot shot and molten iron shells drove the development of ironclads more than the fact that iron was now available in a useful form to make ironclad warships. And you still had to worry about solid shot and explosive shells, which, to be honest, were the main drivers. But the development of hot shot and molten iron shot did definitely weigh in as a significant factor. During the Crimean War, the Royal and French navies had come across quite a number of shore batteries firing heated shot, and they had some problems with that, with some numerous fires being set. You could deal with it by pouring water over them, which obviously was in fairly plentiful supply if you were on board a ship, which was part of the reason why they went for the molten iron, because takes a lot more to cool down. But it was a bit of a race between firefighting capability and the fire causing capability. So it was definitely a factor. Because obviously if you can bounce or repel or shatter the shot coming in, you don't have to worry about your internals being set on fire. So yeah, significant factor, but maybe fourth or fifth on the list of factors driving the development of the ironclad. Bryce McDonald asks, are there any situations where you can see nations building large gun surface combatants again? If so, what are they? What other capabilities should these ships have to make them successful, and how would I design it? So I can see one technological path, sort of tech tree path down which this could become viable, and that is the path of lasers. Lasers are a wonderful thing. So seriously, if laser weapons could be made powerful enough and durable enough to be deployed on ships en masse as a kind of Uber CIWS system, then the current naval paradigm of fire missiles at things then potentially becomes obsolete, because yes, you can armor a missile body to an extent, although that will cost you range and payload, but ultimately the main advantage of missiles is that you can fire them over the horizon, they're self-guiding, you don't have to be up close where you could just use your surface gun. And that means an exposed seeker head. And an exposed seeker head means that it's vulnerable. Plus, of course, as I said before, there are limits to how much you can armor a missile body, and I don't think many people are going to go in for that anyway. The main problem with targeting incoming missiles these days is both the cost of an anti-missile missile and also the physics of it, because missiles, obviously, the incoming missile is just as likely to be traveling at an insane speed as your counter missile is, and you have a limited horizon. So lasers of sufficient power solve an awful lot of those issues by being line of sight, speed of light weapons. So you just point, click, and hopefully missile goes boom. So what I'm trying to get round to with that incredibly convoluted point is that if you can have sufficient durable high power lasers that can shoot down incoming missiles, then the missile paradigm of combat goes away. At which point, how do you attack a ship? Well, you can attack a ship using torpedoes, but if you're going to do that, you use a submarine. So if you want to attack a ship with another ship, what else could you do? Well, you could fire something at it that is significantly less vulnerable to its laser defenses. So what would that be? Well, it would be a shell, because a shell doesn't have to have a seeker head, believe it or not. And I suppose you could go all the way back to really, really basic solid shot if you just want to poke holes in things. But if you look even at an armor-piercing shell of World War II, it's mostly armor-piercing steel with an explosive charge that's a relatively small amount of its overall mass. So you might be able to deflect a small armor-piercing shell with a laser by vaporizing some portion of its external section, but the counter to that is just to make the shell bigger, because then a bigger shell has more mass, and therefore the amount that the laser pings off is going to affect its flight path less. So especially if you've got something like a railgun where the engagement period for the laser is reduced because the shell's traveling so insanely quickly. I can see that being a point at which large gun surface combatants come back, because you'd need the gun to just be able to hurt the ship completely at all, because otherwise your missile armament is useless, and you would need a big gun because it makes the laser less effective against your big armor-piercing shell as opposed to a mass of smaller guns. Railguns optional. Admiral Tiberius asks, how would a 1986 Iowa surface battle group fare against a similar battle group built around the Soviet Kirov class? So the Iowa class's battle group would be an Iowa, obviously, a Ticonderoga, a Kidd, a Spruance, and a couple of Oliver Hazard Perrys. So what would... yeah, so let's get on to that. So for the long distance action, Naval Tomahawk versus Granite. Well, Granite is by far and away the winner. It's a much, much superior anti-shipping weapon in and of itself per missile. On the other hand, Granite is something of a big weapon, and you can fit an awful lot more Tomahawks in and around the various ships than the Soviets could fit Granites. So there is that. Quantity is obviously a quality all of its own. The other thing is really, what is Kirov Surface Action Group or Battle Group or Task Group or whatever you want to call it made up of? I can't seem to find a tremendous amount of information about this kind of stuff, so I'm going to assume that maybe they take a sort of maybe a mirror match, maybe a Slava, a couple of destroyers and a frigate or two. Overall, the Soviet air defenses are actually pretty impressive, mainly those of the Kirov. And for 1986, the Granite is an incredibly advanced missile. It's got basic network capability. It can keep most of its missiles in flight really, really sea skimming, which is still a problem for targets in the 80s. So I think that the Kirov battle group is probably going to land quite a number of heavy hits with its Granites, but at the same time, with the US battle group around, there's not a guarantee that they're going to hit, let alone knock out, the Iowa class. Partly because some of the missiles will obviously be shot down, other missiles may be decoyed, and other missiles still may take out some of the escorts. The main thing being that obviously at that point the escorts are gone, so their ability to defend the fleet against further Granites or other attacks is diminished. I couldn't really call it, to be honest. I mean, if the Iowa class group gets into gun range, then obviously it's all over because the Iowa will walk all over the Soviet group. But in a missile duel, which is obviously going to precede that, it's kind of flip a coin. The Sea Tomahawks could very well take out quite a number, if not all, of the Russian ships if they get through the air defences. But getting through the air defences is not necessarily guaranteed. The Granites are far more likely to slip a missile or two or more through the air defences of an Iowa surface group, but at the same time, yes, they will probably total any of the escorts they hit. But I don't think, unless they're incredibly lucky, I don't think a Granite will total an Iowa with one hit. So it's kind of flip a coin. It could go either way, with the advantage going to the Iowa group, as if both sides survive in damage condition and they end up closing, then the Iowa has a slight advantage. Luce the Lynx asks a question about the Type 21 U-boat. It says, if they could somehow have produced the Type 21 earlier and got a good number into combat, could they have changed the Atlantic theatre in a measurable way? On paper, this could be devastating. The Type 21 has massive underwater endurance for the time. It's got passive sonar, active sonar, radar detectors, radar transmitters. It's much faster underwater than its predecessors, etc. So it could be devastating. The main question is basically when and how long, um, sort of how many can they get into service? Um, because if they get into service a few months earlier, then they could cause a few more shipping losses, but that's not going to change the Atlantic in any measurable way. Um, their main advantage, to be honest, in when it comes to prosecuting the actual attacks, is their significantly greater underwater speed. Because let's face it, not that many U-boats later in the latter half of World War II were caught and sunk on the surface by um, surface escorts, although obviously it would cut down on the number of U-boats sunk by aircraft. The main thing was that once you had a submarine contact on sonar and you could lock it down with a relatively slow underwater speed, there were only so many places it could go, and you could start dropping depth charges. Whereas with a 15 knot unsubmerged speed, the Type 21A is almost as fast um, as some of the surface escorts, and when it kicks up to maximum submerged speed of 17 knots, um, practically you could actually be moving faster than some of the surface escorts, which changes the paradigm of intercepting it and catching it completely. So, yeah, large numbers of Type 21s right in the early part of the war could completely change the Atlantic War in Germany's favour. Mid-war, it would change things. It would certainly change things a lot. I mean, basically you'd probably have to refit older destroyers to maintain the speed advantage, rather than destroyer escorts and frigates and corvettes, which have a commensurately slower speed, which was fine against a sort of sub 10 knot submerged speed of other U-boats, but not against a 15 to 17 knot Type 21. But yeah, the question can't really be answered without the three supplementary questions of when earlier, how many, and are they bringing back the advanced torpedoes at the end of the war as well? Mackinson asks, weird nuclear-powered warships. Was there any attempt to make battleships nuclear-powered and so forth? There were various plans to try and make battleships, or at least the surviving ones, nuclear-armed, um, but not nuclear-powered. Mainly on the basis of there weren't any battleships being built around the time that nuclear power became a viable power plant option for warships. And, well, let's put it this way, taking an Iowa and sticking it through a refit for its conventional power plant is so cost prohibitive. It's one of the major reasons why the Iowas are almost certainly never going to see active service again, let alone the cost of refitting the ship by ripping out its entire steam turbine power plant and replacing it with a nuclear generator, albeit that effectively a nuclear generator for a long time was just a replacement for your oil-fired um, boilers. They still generated steam, which went to turbines, but the logistics of it are just two entirely different power plant design features. It would not have been done or considered. As far as other nuclear-powered ships, as well as your standard cruisers, aircraft carriers, submarines, and battle cruisers in the cases of the Kirovs, which you would expect to be nuclear-powered, or you at least could understand why they tried. There are a few unusual ones. The Russians have a floating nuclear power plant. It's not necessarily technically a ship. They also had a communications warship that was based off the Kirov hull and was also nuclear powered, because I guess you really want signal gain on your antenna or something like that. There's a bunch of nuclear powered icebreakers, although again you can probably see why that would be attractive. There were, however, four nuclear-powered merchant ships, believe it or not. The Japanese built one, they called it the Mutsu. Fortunately, unlike its immediate predecessor, it did not explode, but it was a nuclear-powered freighter. Yeah, that really, no, just no. And the Germans, Americans, and Russians also each built a nuclear-powered merchant ship to see if it had any viable use. Answer, not really. Sven Johnson asks, he says, I mentioned in previous dry docks that the number and caliber of guns could roughly be looked at using a formula of 3 guns of a caliber basically being equivalent to 2 guns of a caliber 2 inches larger for overall effect. Was there an actual formal formula for this, or was it more of a rule of thumb? It was more generally a rule of thumb. It was just a function of the fact that more to do with barbette size, because really you can build a turret with any number and any size of guns that you like, but the barbette is the bit that actually has to fit in the ship. I mean, look at monitors for World War One and World War Two. You could get truly insane guns on a very small hull, as long as the hull was wide enough to accept the barbette. And when you're talking about battleships, barbettes are a major part of the overall ship structure, so you can't really change those. And it's just kind of a happy accident that kind of remove a gun, add 2 inches to caliber, results in a turret that, with a little bit of tweaking, you can just about fit the same onto the same barbette. Albeit you have to rip out most of the the shell supply systems and all that. So yeah, when determining naval armament, when you were considering whether you would go for twin turrets with larger caliber or triple turrets with smaller caliber for a given ship displacement, which could therefore accept a certain size of barbette, part of it would be determined by the type of turret you are going for. So if you, in terms of numbers, so if you're going for 4 turrets, then 4 twins would be attractive, and 4 twins with larger caliber guns would give you a useful broadside and obviously give you the greater armor penetration of the larger caliber weaponry. Whereas if you were going for a 3 gun layout with 2 forward, 1 aft, you probably would want to go for triples because although 3 twins, again, you might be able to fit larger guns, you're down to a 6 gun broadside, which is skirting on the edge of usefulness. I mean, you can have things like the A120s, or A140, sorry, which, or whatever the Super Yamato designation was. I forget right now, sorry, it's early. A150 maybe? Oh no, whatever. Yeah, anyway, the Japanese Super Yamato, let's call it that, they went for 3 twin 20s, but that was because they were adapting off of 3 on Yamato itself. And as we've mentioned before, when it comes to naval guns, it's more a case of what is the caliber you comfortably feel can punch through your opponent's shipping, and then as many of those as you possibly can. So, yeah, if you, like, say, with the Montanas, you are happy with a 16-inch 50, so you just go, right, we'll have 4 triples of that. Whereas if they hadn't been as confident in the 16-inch 50, if, I don't know, maybe the Japanese had built a Super Yamato or something, then they might have gone, actually, maybe we want to switch that for 4 twin 18s. But as a baseline, I mean, obviously hindsight is 2020, but as a baseline, if you're going to travel back in time and advise people, you might stand a chance of changing timelines quite significantly if you advise them to go for 3 or 4 triple turrets of whatever they think they can just about get away with, on the basis of future-proofing the ships to be able to be refitted potentially with twins of larger caliber, which will keep a ship viable between the interwar periods. Brad asks, can you explain how the coloured fleets in the Royal Navy worked? I know that admirals were promoted up through varying types of eventual retirement, but little else. In the Wikipedia page made much sense. Well, that's not exactly new, is it? So basically, and trying to keep this as simple as possible, for most of the Royal Navy's history as an organised formation and fleet, so you're talking from maybe the 15th, 16th centuries onwards, the fleet would be split into 3 squadrons, and kind of taken off of army formations on land. You had a vanguard, a rearguard, and the centre part of the formation. And these were divided into squadrons by colour, so the red and the white and the blue. So The Red was the most senior squadron, and therefore the admiral of the entire fleet would command. He would be the commander flying the Red pennant. The Blue was reserved for the rear formation, and the White was the fleet admiral's second in command. So although the blue squadron would always be the rear squadron, whether the red squadron was the forward, the vanguard, or whether it was the center squadron, changed depending on the command preferences of the admiral in question. So that's where you get those the three colours from. And initially, those flags would just be big flags of that respective colour. Although the white was not a giant white flag, because obviously that could give something of the wrong connotation. It would usually be a cross of St. George or something along that nature. They then would go through a whole series of iterations for different flags, because obviously there wasn't just Admiral. You could have Commodore, Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, actual Full Admiral, etc. So it led to rather interesting combinations so you could have something like Rear Admiral of the Red or Vice Admiral of the White, etc. And to add even more confusion, you would advance through the ranks with your title first remaining the same, and advance through the ranks of the squadrons from blue through red to white, and then once you'd gotten through all of those, you would then progress onto your next rank. So you go from Rear Admiral, say, to Vice Admiral, but you'd start out at the bottom again with the blue squadron, and then progress through white to red, and so on. So by the time you got into the 1800s, you had this wonderful little chart showing your progression, all snakes and ladders style. So the most senior admiral would be the Admiral of the Red, and the ensigns there are a bit more familiar to people these days. And then round about the time of the ironclads arising, they just scrapped the whole idea, and the Royal Navy adopted the white ensign, which obviously people today are very familiar with. The red ensign was hived off to British merchant ships, and the blue ensign went over to naval reserves and support units. Christopher Dent says, for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, assuming that Kurita's Force A presses on after dispersing Taffy 3 and enters the mouth of Lake Gulf, they are then met by the 7th Fleet support forces fresh out of Surigao Strait. What would the outcome have been? Okay. Well, if you were listening to this at the time of release, then a few days ago, you will hopefully have seen the video chronicling the historical Battle of Samar. And let's just say that rather than answering this here, I will answer it in, well, again, assuming you're watching this on the day of release, in 3 days or so. Hopefully, at least to the large extent of what you're asking. Mason Asher Stewart asks, the County class seemed to perform poorly whenever they came up against other heavy cruisers, such as Canberra at Savo Island, Berwick versus Italian cruisers, and Hipper. Were there major disadvantages in their design from the tonnage restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty, or was it just luck? It's a mixture. I mean, the Battle of Savo Island is a little bit unfair on poor old Canberra. It was highlighted by flares and targeted by 4 enemy heavy cruisers, at which point it doesn't matter how good your treaty cruiser is. You're a little bit stuffed at that point. I mean, the thing is, even at Savo Island, Canberra showed it was actually very good at dodging enemy torpedoes. It's just maybe not so good at absorbing the fire of at least 4 enemy cruisers at once, but then again, show me a cruiser that would be. And given that one of those was a 15,000-ton Japanese, shall we say, creatively interpreted version of the treaty cruiser, again, not really much of a surprise there. Berwick seems to be cursed by quite bad luck. Against the Italian ships, it basically took 2 early hits that effectively crippled the ship. Its later action against Hipper is much less excusable. It was at full combat stations, and it should have been able to fight back much more effectively against Hipper than it actually did. So potentially, well, you could argue that whether that's a flaw in the design or a flaw in the crew, leave it up to you to make your mind up. On the other hand, you have things like Norfolk, along with obviously Belfast and Sheffield, taking on the Scharnhorst and standing up quite well in that particular engagement at the North Cape. There weren't, but outside of those, there weren't actually that many opportunities for the county class to take on ships of equal tonnage or greater, as circumstances of the war turned out. So partly partly bad luck, I would say, in answer to your question. I mean, they did have limitations, as all treaty cruisers did. In the British case, they tried to put much heavier protection over in boxes over the vital systems rather than have continuous belt protection, which is admittedly a design weakness. But yeah, there's treaty cruiser restrictions. There's always going to be design weakness in them somewhere, unless you blatantly cheat. And finally, Jack Ace asks, in cases such as the Nelson, HMS Nelson, and USS Yorktown, when a large capital ship is damaged and required to return to port to undergo several months of repairs and/or modernisation, what role does the ship's crew and officer play during this time in the dry dock? During wartime, I mean, there will obviously be a skeleton crew on board the ship, just keeping general bits of maintenance going and repairing various systems that they are possibly more qualified to repair than the people who may be available at the dry dock itself. Um, but it also depends on what else the Navy is doing at the time. So, say, for example, at the time when Yorktown is available, you've got a large number of specialist carrier crew. The Americans at this point have more specialist carrier crew than they do carriers after the initial wartime losses. So, apart from cycling people through leave and maybe a bit of onshore training in new bits of tech and such, and helping out with the repair efforts, they're not going to be doing much else. Whereas if the ship is one where potentially they have more ships than they have crew trained for them, then the crew might be, if the ship's going to be in harbour for quite a while, might be split up, or some of them might be sent off to serve in other ships. So you see this with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau when they are in Brest before the Channel Dash. A bunch of their experienced crew gets taken back to Germany and dispersed through a number of other ships. And similarly, later in the war, when various carriers came in, the Americans were obviously commissioning Essex class and Casablanca class and Independence class like it was going out of fashion. So if a ship like, I don't know, say the Franklin comes in and it's quite badly damaged and it's going to need extensive time in dock, it's much better to take that skilled crew resource and distribute it through other carriers that need the crew rather than keep them around not doing much of anything. In something like HMS Nelson's case, well, they're being repaired in the States, so the United States is not known for having large numbers of Royal Navy ships in its docks, at least not since a little thing called the American Revolution. So the crew are kind of, well, enjoy the United States, lads, and come back when we're fixed. So yeah, it basically comes down to, can the crew be gainfully employed elsewhere? If so, then they probably will get redistributed. If it's better to keep them with the ship, either because you don't have that many ships of that type, or possibly because they have particularly specialist skills related to that ship, then obviously you'll keep them there. And that wraps up the Patreon edition of the Drydock. I will be moving house pretty much at the time that you are listening to this, and for the week thereafter. I hopefully will have a bank of videos up and ready to be uploaded, so you won't miss out on anything. But if, say, in a week or two you notice the acoustics and audio on the video have changed somewhat, that'll be why. If they've changed for the better, then hooray. If they've changed for the worse, please do let me know, and I will reconfigure my new fancy recording area. Thanks very much for listening, and see you in the next video.